Welcome to Late Night History. Tonight I want to tell you about a rock. Just a rock at first. The kind of thing you might walk right past without a second glance. The kind of dull, pale stone that makes up half the quiet places of the world. But this one is different. This one is soft. Soft enough that you could take a piece of antler, or a sliver of bone, or a simple iron pick, and scrape it away the way you might scrape wax from the side of a candle. Soft enough to dig your fingers into almost if you worked at it long enough. And here is the strange part, the part that will sit at the center of everything we wander into tonight. The moment you cut into it, the moment you peel back its skin and let the open air touch the fresh surface you have exposed, that surface begins to change. It begins to harden. The very act of carving a wall starts to make that wall stronger. The rock loses its moisture, slowly, quietly, the way a damp cloth left out overnight goes stiff by morning. And as it dries, a kind of crust forms over it, a firmer outer layer over a softer body within, like the crackled top of a loaf of bread cooling on a windowsill. Soft inside, hard outside. A rock that you can shape with the simplest tools, and that thanks you for shaping it by becoming harder, more durable, more lasting. Now hold that image in your mind because it is the whole secret. A rock you can carve with a bone, a rock that hardens the moment it meets the air. Everything we are going to see tonight grows out of that one strange, gentle property, and I promise you, by the time we are done, you will understand how a single quality of a single kind of stone allowed human beings to do something that if you described it to a stranger, they would not quite believe. Because people did not just scratch a few shallow rooms into this rock. They did not stop at a cellar or a cave or a hidden chamber for storing grain through a hard winter. No. Down in central Turkey, in a place called Cappadocia, on the high, wind-swept plateau of Anatolia, people took this soft and hardening rock and they hollowed out a city beneath their own feet. Not a building, a city. A city that goes down and down and down again, level beneath level beneath level, until you have descended through something like 18 separate floors of carved rooms and passages and stairwells, until you are standing roughly 60 meters below the surface of the earth. 60 meters, that is the height of a tall building, except inverted, sunk entirely into stone with no skyline, no windows, no sky at all, only depth, only the cool, close darkness and the rooms opening one into the next going deeper. And it was not built for a handful of people. The figure that gets repeated again and again by the people who study these places and the people who visit them is something on the order of 20,000 human beings, together with their animals, together with their stores of food, their barrels and their jars and their sacks of grain. 20,000 souls able to come down out of the daylight and live here in the rock, sealed away from the world above. 18 levels, 60 meters down. 20,000 people and no sky. The town that sits on the surface above this hidden place is called Derinkuyu now, in Nevşehir province, and the name itself is a small, quiet clue. Derinkuyu means, roughly, deep well, and we will see before the night is through just how fitting that name turns out to be, because the wells that reach down through this place are part of what made living in it possible at all. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. We have a long way to go down, and there is no hurry. There is never any hurry here. Before we begin the descent, before we step into the dark and start feeling our way down through the levels, I want to ask you something the way I always do. Wherever you are tonight, in whatever corner of the world has gone quiet around you, I would genuinely like to know. Tell me where you are listening from. Leave it in the comments, a city, a country, a single word, whatever you like, and let this strange old place down in the Anatolian rock become, just for tonight, a thing we are wondering at together, all of us scattered across the dark side of the planet, all of us awake when we should be sleeping, drawn to the same buried mystery. And if you are new here, if you have only just found your way to this quiet little corner, you might think about subscribing, so the next slow story finds you when you need it. But there is no pressure in any of that. None at all. Because what I really want you to do, more than anything, is to let yourself go soft, the way that rock is soft. Let your shoulders come down from wherever they have been holding themselves all day. Let the weight of the day settle out of you slowly, the way moisture settles out of stone. We are going to take this very, very gently. We are going to walk down into the earth together, one level at a time, and you do not need to stay awake to follow it. You do not need to remember any of it. If you drift off somewhere in the middle of the descent, somewhere between the surface and the cool, deep dark, that is exactly right. That is the whole point. I will keep talking, the story will keep unfolding slow and steady, like water moving through stone, and you can sink into it as far as you like. So, let us begin where everything here begins. Not with the city, not with the people, with the fire. Because long, long before any human hand pressed a tool to this rock, before there were any tools at all, before there were any hands, this whole landscape was made by volcanoes. The rock we have been talking about, the soft, carvable, hardening rock, it did not simply exist. It was manufactured, you might say, in the great furnaces of the earth and laid down across this part of Anatolia by a handful of mountains whose names are worth saying slowly, the way you would say the names of old, sleeping giants. The greatest of them is Mount Erciyes. In Turkish it is Erciyes Dağ, and it rises to nearly 4,000 meters, around 3,917, a vast snow-capped cone standing over the city of Kayseri. It is the tallest mountain in central Anatolia, and for a long stretch of the deep past it was one of the engines that built this whole strange country of rock. Then there is Mount Hasan, Hasan Dağ, off to the southwest, another great volcanic peak watching over the plain. And there is Göllüdağ, lower, quieter in the memory, but part of the same family. Together, along with others, these mountains make up what the geologists call the Cappadocian Volcanic Province, a whole region defined by its fire, a whole landscape that is, in a sense, the cooled and hardened breath of these volcanoes. And they were not active for a year, or a century, or even a few thousand years. They were active across an almost unimaginable stretch of time, from what is called the late Miocene through the Quaternary, which is to say from something like 10 million years ago down to under 2 million years ago, with some volcanic stirrings continuing far, far more recently than that. 10 million years. Try, if you can, to let that number be soft in your mind rather than sharp. Do not try to grasp it. Just let it be vast. Generation upon generation of mountains, breathing fire, falling quiet, breathing again, across spans of time so long that the human story, all of it, every king and every war and every city ever built, fits into the thinnest sliver at the very end. The rock came first. The rock came almost unthinkably first. And it took its time. So picture one of these eruptions, not a slow ooze of glowing lava down a mountainside, the kind of thing you might imagine when you hear the word volcano. Something else, something faster, and in its way, far more violent. These were great explosive eruptions, the kind that do not pour but blast, that throw enormous quantities of ash and rock and gas up and out in a single roaring breath. And then comes the thing that mattered most for our story. The thing the geologists call a pyroclastic flow. A pyroclastic flow is one of the most fearsome things this planet can produce, and yet, out of all that fury, it left behind the gentlest possible rock. Let me try to make it plain. Imagine all that ash and pumice and superheated gas blasted out of the mountain, and now imagine it is too heavy to keep rising. So it collapses. It comes back down, and instead of falling straight to earth, it begins to rush down the slopes and across the land as a single ground-hugging avalanche. Not of snow, of fire, a churning, boiling cloud of hot ash and shattered pumice and choking gas, moving across the ground at tremendous speed, hugging the contours of the land the way a flood would, filling every valley, racing across every plain. Hot enough to scorch everything in its path, fast enough that nothing could outrun it. And then, having spent its fury, it slows. It comes to rest. All that hot ash and pumice settles down across the landscape in a thick, smothering blanket. And here is the quiet miracle of it. The particles are still hot when they settle, hot enough that they can fuse together, weld themselves to one another. As they cool, the way the embers of a fire will sometimes crust together into a single mass overnight. The geologists call the rock this leaves behind Ignimbrite. And where the welding is strong, you get what is called welded tuff. It is the cooled body of the avalanche. It is the pyroclastic flow itself, frozen in place, becomes stone. And the thing about Ignimbrite, the thing that makes it the secret hero of this whole night, is what it is made of and how it is put together. It is born of ash and pumice, you may know, is that strange volcanic rock so full of tiny holes and bubbles that it can sometimes float on water. All those trapped pockets of gas frozen into the rock as it cooled. So the rock that results is porous. It is full of little spaces, little voids, little held breaths. And because it is so porous, it is light, low in density. And because it is light and full of holes, it is relatively weak as rock goes. Not the hard, ringing, unyielding stone you might strike a spark from, a softer thing, a more forgiving thing, a rock that gives way, that can be cut and scraped and shaped without the iron and the fire and the long, brutal labor that working harder stone demands. That porousness, that lightness, that gentle weakness is precisely, exactly why a human being could one day pick up a simple tool and begin to carve a city into it. The volcanoes did not just provide the raw material, they provided rock with the perfect personality for the job. Hard enough to hold a shape, to hold a ceiling over your head, to hold a city. Soft enough to yield to bone and antler and iron. The fire of the deep past made a stone that was, almost as if by design, exactly carvable. Now layered in with the Ignimbrite woven through this whole landscape, there is the closely related rock the people of the region have worked with for thousands of years, and that is volcanic tuff. Tuff is, at its simplest, consolidated volcanic ash. Ash that fell and settled and over time hardened just enough to become rock, but never very hard at all. And the tuff of Cappadocia has a particular character that the people who lived here learned to read and to use as surely as a carpenter learns the grain of wood. When it is fresh, when it has just been exposed, when it is still damp from the moisture held deep inside it, this tuff is soft, genuinely soft, workable with the simplest of implements. And this is not a modern discovery, not something figured out by geologists with instruments. It is a practical truth that the people of this land have known and used for millennia, passed down and lived out across countless generations. They knew that you could take a freshly opened face of this rock, this damp interior stone, and you could shape it. And they knew the other half of the secret too, the half we started with tonight. They knew that once you cut it and left it open to the air, the surface would change. As the rock loses its moisture, as it dries, as the minerals at its surface react with the open air, it forms a harder, more durable outer skin, a crust, a shell. So the walls you carved would, in time, grow firmer than the rock you carved them from. The interior stayed soft, ready to be opened further. The surface hardened, ready to last. Sit with how perfect that is for a moment. Imagine you are the one doing the carving. You open a face of rock, and it is soft, and you work it, and you cut your room or your passage. And the surfaces you have finished, the walls and the ceiling, they begin to set and harden behind you, growing stronger by the day, while ahead of you, deeper in, the rock you have not yet reached stays soft and moist and waiting. You are always working into the soft and always leaving the hard behind you. The deeper you go, the firmer the city you have already made becomes. It is almost as though the rock cooperates, as though it wants to be lived in. And this raises one of the first quiet questions of the night, the kind of question I want to plant now and let grow slowly in the dark as we go. If the rock hardens once it meets the air, if every exposed surface turns to a tougher shell, then how on earth did they keep digging? How did they go down 18 levels, 60 meters into the earth, if the rock was forever turning hard the moment they reached it? Hold that, we will come to it. The answer is simpler and lovelier than you might think, and it has to do with that soft, moist heart of the stone that always lies just a little further in, but not yet. There is no rush. Let it sit. So that is the rock. That is the protagonist of our whole story, the true main character, more than any king or any builder. A rock born of fire, blasted out of great mountains in roaring clouds, settled in thick, welded blankets across the high plateau, porous and light and weak and soft, and possessed of that one extraordinary trick, soft when wet, hard when dry, soft within, hard without. Ignimbrite and tuff, the cooled breath of Erciyes and Hasan and Göllüdağ. And here is something I want you to hold on to gently as we drift deeper into the night, because it is the thread that ties everything together. The thing that most people miss when they hear about this place. Most people, when they learn about Cappadocia, learn about two separate wonders as though they had nothing to do with each other. They hear about the underground cities, the hidden levels, the buried places, and they file that away under mystery, under the strange and the unexplained. And then, quite separately, they hear about the famous landscape above ground, the one you may have seen in photographs even if you never knew its name. The forest of tall, slender stone pillars rising out of the valleys, each one tapering up toward a strange, rounded cap, like a field of stone mushrooms or a crowd of pale stone figures standing in the dusk. The fairy chimneys. People see those and they file them away under scenery, under the beautiful and the picturesque. Two marvels, one eerie, one lovely, filed in two different drawers, but they are not two things. That is the quiet secret at the heart of all of this. The thing I most want you to carry away from tonight, even if you remember nothing else. The hidden city below and the strange spires above are the very same thing, seen from two directions. They are both made of the same rock. They are both the children of the same eruptions. The exact same property of that exact same stone, soft enough to carve, hardening as it meets the air, is what let human beings hollow out the levels below, and what let wind and rain and time sculpt the pillars above. One geological accident, one blanket of volcanic rock laid down by the same mountains in the same deep past. And out of that single cause, two faces. The world reached down into it and made a city. The weather worked across the top of it and made a landscape. Same rock, same event, Two sculptures, one carved by human hands going down, the other carved by the slow patience of the sky coming down from above. We will come to those fairy chimneys properly in time. We will stand among them and watch how the rain and the wind shape them, how a harder cap of stone protects the soft column beneath it, how the whole strange forest of them comes to be. But I wanted you to know now at the very start, before we descend, that the place we are going down into and the place that stands so beautifully above it are not strangers to one another. They are the same stone telling the same story in two different voices. Below, the voice is human, above, the voice is weather. And underneath both, holding both up, is the rock. So let us return to the rock itself and let us start, very slowly, to think about going down into it. Imagine standing on the surface of the Cappadocian plateau. You are high up here, on the Anatolian plateau, more than 1,000 meters above the level of the distant sea, in a wide, open, dry country of pale rock and big skies. The summers are hot, the winters are cold and hard, the way they always are in these high continental lands, far from any softening ocean. The wind comes across the plateau with nothing much to stop it, and beneath your feet, beneath the thin soil and the surface stone, lies that thick blanket of tuff and ignimbrite, dozens upon dozens of meters of it, the accumulated breath of all those ancient eruptions, soft within, waiting. Now imagine that someone very long ago knelt here on this surface and began to dig. Not down through hard rock, fighting the stone for every inch, but down through this forgiving tuff, scraping and cutting, opening a shaft, opening a stair, opening a first chamber just beneath the surface. And imagine that the surfaces they opened began, as we said, to harden behind them, to set into firmer walls, while the rock they cut into next was still soft, still moist, still yielding. Down they went, a first level, then beneath it a second, then a third, each one a little further from the daylight, a little deeper into the constant, patient cool of the rock. And that cool is its own quiet wonder, worth pausing on as we sink. This rock, this thick mass of porous tuff, has what is called thermal mass. It holds its temperature. It does not race up to meet the heat of a Cappadocian summer afternoon, nor plunge down to meet the bite of a winter night. Deep inside it, away from the surface, the temperature simply stays where it is, steady, cool, and even all year round. Outside on the plateau, the seasons might swing wildly, baking and freezing by turns. But down in the rock, it is always the same gentle coolness, the kind of coolness you feel when you step into an old stone cellar on a hot day and the air closes over you like cool water. That steadiness is not an accident the people exploited by luck. It is one of the deepest reasons this rock was worth living in. A constant, cool temperature, never too hot, never too cold, perfect for human bodies to rest in, and perfect too for keeping food, for storing grain and wine and oil through the long swing of the seasons without it spoiling. The rock was a refuge and a larder, both by its very nature. It kept the living comfortable, and it kept their food from turning, and it asked nothing in return but the willingness to carve. So they carved, and as you go down with me now, in your imagination, level by level into this cool and steady dark, let yourself feel how the daylight thins and falls away behind you. The first level is still close to the surface. Perhaps a little light reaches it, perhaps you can still feel the season in the air. But by the second, the third, the world above has begun to grow distant and unreal. The temperature has evened out into that perfect cellar cool. The sounds of the surface, the wind, the birds, the voices have faded into a deep and gentle silence, the silence of being held inside the earth itself. And ahead of you, below you, the levels keep going. A fourth, a fifth. Down and down, the stairwells turning, the passages narrowing and opening, the rooms branching off to either side, all of it cut from that single, soft and hardening stone. We are only just at the beginning of the descent. We have only just stepped down off the surface into the first cool reaches of the rock. There is so much further to go, so much waiting below us in the dark. The wells and the air shafts that let 20,000 people breathe and drink down here, the great stone doors that could be rolled shut to seal the levels away, the stables and the kitchens with their soot still on the ceilings, the wine presses, the chapel cut from the living rock far beneath the surface, and the long, long tunnel that runs for miles through the earth to another buried city entirely. All of it is waiting. All of it grew out of that one rock and its one strange gift. But for now, let us just stand here together, a little way down in the cool and the quiet, with the daylight already fading behind and above us, and the soft rock all around, and the deep mystery of who first knelt here and began to dig, still entirely unanswered, still waiting somewhere below in the dark. We have all the night in the world to go down into it. There is nowhere we need to be but here, sinking slowly one gentle level at a time, into the rock that fire made soft, into the city that the rock made possible. So take a slow breath of that cool, even underground air. Let it fill you and let it leave you, unhurried. And come a little further down with me, into the dark, into the stone, into the deep well of Derinkuyu, where the next levels are waiting, and the air itself, somehow, still moves. To understand how it moves, we have to go back further than the digging, back before the first hand ever pressed a tool to this stone, to the moment the rock itself was made. Because none of this, not the city, not the levels, not the air still circling in the dark, would have been possible without a particular kind of violence in the deep past, the kind that builds rather than destroys, slowly over an almost unimaginable stretch of time. Far above us now, somewhere out past the fading surface, stand the volcanoes that made all of this. There is Mount Erciyes, Erciyes-Dağ, rising nearly 3,900 meters into the sky near the city of Kayseri, the great snow-topped presence that watches over this whole country of stone. There is Mount Hasan, Hasan-Dağ, standing apart on the plain. And there is Göllüdağ, lower and quieter, but part of the same family. Together they belong to what the geologists call the Cappadocian Volcanic Province, a long-lived region of fire set into the Anatolian plateau, where the ground has been building and breaking itself for longer than we can easily hold in the mind. These mountains were not always quiet. Across the late Miocene and on through the Quaternary, that is, from something like 10 million years ago down to less than 2 million years ago, with some activity carrying on far more recently still, they erupted again and again, not always gently. And it is what they threw out in those eruptions, more than the mountains themselves, that matters to us down here tonight. When a volcano of this kind erupts at its most violent, it does not only send up a column of ash. Sometimes that column collapses, and what comes down is something far stranger and far more dangerous, a thing the geologists call a pyroclastic flow. Picture it, if you can do so calmly, from a safe distance of millions of years. A ground-hugging avalanche of hot ash and pumice and gas pouring down and outward across the land, fast and low and burning, smothering everything it touches. And then eventually it stops, it comes to rest, it settles across the country in a thick, hot blanket. And here is the quiet miracle of it. The particles in that settled blanket are still hot enough sometimes to weld together as they cool, fusing into solid rock where moments before there was only a storm of loose ash. This is how Ignimbrite is born. That is the name for it, Ignimbrite. the rock that comes from a pyroclastic flow that lay down and welded itself into stone. Layer upon layer of it, eruption after eruption, building up across the region over those long ages until the whole plateau wore a deep coat of it. But it is a particular kind of stone because it was made from ash and pumice and trapped gas, all welded loosely together rather than forged under crushing pressure. Ignimbrite is porous. It is full of tiny spaces. It is low in density, light for its size, and, by the standards of most rock, relatively weak. And that weakness, that softness, is not a flaw. Down here tonight, it is the whole reason we exist at all. A harder rock, a granite, a true mountain stone would have turned away every antler and every bone and every iron pick that was ever set against it. This rock did not turn them away. This rock let people in. Alongside the welded ignimbrite lies the softer tuff, which is simply volcanic ash that has consolidated into stone, pressed and settled together into something solid but yielding, especially where it is freshly exposed, especially where it is still a little damp. And that is the secret the whole region turns upon. Cappadocian tuff, when it is fresh from the earth or still holds some moisture within it, is soft enough to be shaped by the simplest of tools. A determined person with patience and an iron edge can scrape it away, can hollow it, can open a doorway in it, can carve a room and then a corridor and then a stair, sinking deeper and deeper with every season of work. And yet, and this is the part that still seems almost designed, though of course it was not, though it is only chemistry and air and time, that same soft rock does not stay soft once it is opened to the world. As the freshly cut surface meets the open air, it begins to dry. It loses its moisture, the minerals at its skin react with the air, and slowly, over the days and the years, that exposed face hardens into a tougher, more durable shell, a skin of stronger stone wrapped over the soft interior beneath. Think for a moment of what that means for the people who knelt here in the dark with their simple tools. Every wall they carved was soft enough to keep carving inward into the moist, unexposed rock still hidden behind the face, but every wall they left behind, every ceiling and every doorway and every finished room, began the very moment it was cut to grow harder, to set, to strengthen, sealing itself into permanence even as they moved on deeper. The act of building this city was, in the same breath, the act of making it last. And so it has lasted, far longer than the hands that made it, far longer than the names of whoever first knelt here, waiting in the cool and the quiet for us to find our slow way down to it tonight. And there is something else the same eruptions gave this landscape, something that rises rather than descends, something that can be seen from a great distance on a clear morning when the light comes low and flat across the plateau, and the whole valley seems to be populated by a quiet crowd of standing figures, the fairy chimneys. In Turkish, peri bacaları, the chimneys of the fairies, or the chimneys of the spirits, depending on which tradition you are drawing from and how loosely you translate. They rise from the valley floors and from the slopes and from the ridgelines, these tall, tapering columns of pale tuff, some of them capped with a darker, heavier stone hat perched at the top like something balanced there by a careful hand. Some stand alone. Some cluster in families of 3 or 4 or a dozen, leaning slightly toward one another in the way that very tall things sometimes seem to, as though conferring quietly on something none of the rest of us can hear. And people looked at them across the centuries, across the long, slow seasons of this plateau, and people called them what they called them, the chimneys of the fairies, the places where spirits lived, the homes of things that were not quite human. Because what else do you call a stone pillar that seems to have grown rather than been built, that has a hat and a waist and a taper that almost suggests intention. The folk tradition is a tradition, not a formation claim. The fairies did not make these pillars, but there is something in the human need to name the inexplicable, something worth sitting with for a moment, in the fact that the same people who were digging one kind of wonder beneath the ground were looking up at another kind of wonder above it and reaching, quite reasonably, for the word that their language offered for things beyond ordinary explanation. Because both of these things, as the underground city descending 18 levels into the earth and the strange tall pillars rising from the valley floor into the sky, came from the same source, from the same eruptions, from the same blanket of volcanic ash and pyroclastic material that the Cappadocian volcanoes laid across this landscape across millions of years of intermittent, enormous geological fury. The Ignimbrite and the tuff that let people carve rooms downward into the earth is the identical material that wind and rain and the slow action of water carved upward into columns above it. The same substance, the same physical properties. One event seen from two directions. From below, looking up at the people who dug, and from above, looking up at the pillars that erosion made. This is the thing that most accounts of Cappadocia miss, or fail to say plainly. The underground cities and the fairy chimneys are usually treated as two separate marvels, two distinct things to see and to marvel at, two entries on the itinerary of the curious traveller, but they are not separate. They are the same event expressed in two different directions by two different sculpting forces. The volcanoes provided the material, then gravity and water and wind worked on it from outside, and human hands worked on it from within, and the result was a landscape that looks as though it could not possibly exist. Columns rising above and chambers descending below, and all of it made from the same pale stone, the same compressed and welded ash from the same ancient fires. To understand how the fairy chimneys form, you need to understand something about the tuff's relationship with erosion, and it is not a complicated relationship. The tuff is soft, rain falls on it, wind moves across it. Both of these things wear it away slowly and steadily over long periods of time. But the tuff is not entirely uniform across the plateau. In some places, harder, denser volcanic material, a boulder of basalt, say, or a plug of more resistant rock that came from a later phase of volcanic activity, a cap of something darker and tougher and far less willing to be worn away, sits on top of a column of softer tuff. And what happens when rain and wind move across a surface like that is simply what always happens when erosion encounters varying resistance. The hard material protects everything directly beneath it, and the soft material all around it, all the unprotected tuff on every side, is slowly stripped away. So you are left with a column. The capstone sits on top, unchanged, as resistant as it always was. The tuff beneath it, sheltered by that cap from the rain that falls directly downward, survives. But the tuff on all sides, exposed to every rain and every wind from every direction, is slowly, season by season, century by century, removed. And what remains when the surrounding rock has been carried away by water into the valley below is a tall, tapering pillar of tuff, a column with a harder hat of rock at its summit, rising into the air like something deliberate, something constructed, something that somebody must have intended. Nobody intended it. It is only the difference in resistance between two types of rock playing out across what geologists call geological time, which is to say, a span of years so large that a human lifetime fits inside it the way a single word fits inside a very long book. The caps on the fairy chimneys are simply harder than the columns they protect. The columns exist only because of those caps. And when the cap eventually goes, when the hard stone at the summit is finally undercut, loosened, and falls, the unprotected column below it is given over to the same erosion that stripped the surrounding rock away, and it too begins to disappear, wearing down from its top, narrowing, softening, and eventually returning to the valley floor as sediment carried off by the rain. There are valleys in Cappadocia where you can see this process at every stage. A fresh column, still capped, still rising sharp and tall and confident in its hat. A column mid-process, the cap slightly tilted, slightly undermined, the column beneath beginning to lose its sharpness at the summit. An old column, capless now, its top rounded and softened by years of direct exposure, shorter than it once was, returning slowly to the earth. And beside all of them, the surrounding valley floor, the remnants of all the tuff that once stood as high as the chimneys do now, reduced to the gently rolling contours of a landscape that was once as tall as what still stands above it. The fairy chimneys are not unusual formations. They are the survivors. They are what is left after everything else has been taken, and the rock that makes them, the same tuff, the same Ignimbrite laid down by the same eruptions from Mount Erciyes and Mount Hasan and Göllüdağ, is the same rock that allowed someone, long ago, to begin carving in the other direction entirely. Consider for a moment the peculiarity of that geological coincidence. The same property that makes tuff vulnerable to erosion, its softness, its porosity, its relative inability to resist the patient work of water and wind, is the property that made it carvable by hand. A rock hard enough to resist erosion would have produced no fairy chimneys because the rain would simply have run off it without effect, and it would also have produced no underground cities because you cannot carve granite or basalt with an antler or an iron pick in any reasonable span of a human life. The tuff is carvable precisely because it is soft. It sculpts into chimneys precisely because it is soft. The same vulnerability is, in both cases, the source of the wonder. One rock, one property, two landscapes, one rising above the plateau in columns of pale stone, one descending beneath it in levels of carved rooms and corridors and stairways and wells, and beneath the surface of the Anatolian plateau, below the valley where the fairy chimneys stand, below the town of Derinkuyu in Nevşehir province, a town whose name, in Turkish, means something close to deep well, a name that turns out to be both a description and a kind of understatement. What remains of the vast, deliberate excavation of this rock is still there, still cut, still standing, mostly. The ceilings of the upper levels still in place, the doorways still passable, the rooms still recognizable as rooms, the corridors still going where they always went, downward. The name is worth lingering on for a moment. Derinkuyu, deep well. It is a name that seems, at first, to describe only one feature of the place. The deep shaft of a well, the primary water source, which is a practical and unremarkable thing in any settlement. But it is also a name that accidentally, or perhaps not so accidentally, describes the whole nature of the settlement itself. This is a place defined by depth, by the willingness to go down, by the decision made at some point by some group of people in some season whose precise date is not entirely certain, to go not up and outward with their building, not to raise walls and stack stones and add height to the skyline, but to go in the opposite direction entirely, to descend. They could do this because of the rock, because the tuff in this part of the plateau, the consolidated volcanic ash from those same ancient eruptions, has a property that makes it uniquely suited to this kind of work. When the rock is freshly exposed, when a surface is first cut open, when the tool breaks through from the carved space into the still untouched material beyond, that interior face is soft. The moisture that the rock has held, the water absorbed over years and centuries from rainfall moving slowly through the porous material, is still present in the uncut interior. It has not had time to dry, it has not had time to react with the open air. It is, at the moment of cutting, as soft as it will ever be, and so it can be cut again. The pick goes in. The antler or bone or iron edge scrapes and pulls. The material comes away, and another few centimeters of new room are opened from the soft face of what was, a moment before, solid rock. And then, as the tool moves on inward, as the carver goes deeper into the new face, the old face, the cut surface left behind begins to change. The moisture leaves it, the air reaches it. The chemistry of the rock's surface begins to do what it always does on exposure, forming a harder outer shell, a skin of more durable material that protects the soft interior from further damage. The room begins to set. The wall they left behind as they move deeper begins to strengthen, not into granite, not into something impervious and cold and impossibly hard, but into something noticeably more resistant than the material they are cutting at the advancing face. Something that will hold. This is how they could keep going. This is the answer to the question that the strangeness of this place seems to demand. The question of how you can carve deeper and deeper into a rock that hardens as you cut it. The answer is that you do not carve the hardened surfaces. You carve only the new face, the moist interior face that has never been exposed. You leave the hardened walls behind you as structure, as the rooms and corridors and stairways that hold the weight of everything above them. And you push the soft face inward and downward into rock that is still moist, still uncured, still waiting to be opened. The rock's own chemistry is the tool. The very process of building is the process of making permanent what you have built. 18 levels, approximately 60 meters down, some measurements placing the lowest accessible point somewhat deeper than that, depending on how the levels are counted and which measurement is used. A number that is worth translating into something easier to picture. 60 meters is roughly the height of a 20-story building. Imagine standing at the base of a 20-story building and looking up at it, and then imagine that the same distance exists not above you but below you, not in open air and glass and steel, but in carved rock, in tunnels and rooms and stairways hewn by hand from the same volcanic ash that fell from Erciyes and Hasan and Göllüdağ and settled here across millions of years. 60 meters of human work going down. 18 levels, each one more removed from the sky than the last, each one a little cooler, a little quieter, a little more entirely itself. And throughout all of those levels, throughout all of that depth and all of that carved interior space, a quality of the rock was doing something that had nothing to do with the ease of carving, but had everything to do with the possibility of living. The Anatolian plateau sits at roughly 1,000 meters above sea level, and at that elevation, and in the continental climate of central Anatolia, the summers are hot and the winters are cold, and the swings between seasons are real and sometimes harsh. On the surface, in the open air, the temperature follows the sun. It climbs through the morning, peaks through the afternoon, falls through the evening, drops through the night, and then begins again. And from season to season it does the same, climbing in the long months of summer into genuine heat, falling in the long months of winter into genuine cold. Underground, none of that happens. The tuff, the same porous, low-density volcanic rock that absorbs moisture, also absorbs temperature. It is a material of considerable thermal mass, which is a way of saying that it changes temperature slowly, that it takes a very long time to heat up, and an equally long time to cool down, that it resists the rapid swings that the surface experiences with each passing day and each passing season. Go deep enough into the tuff and you reach a zone where the temperature is not the temperature of the season. It is not the temperature of this particular summer or this particular winter. It is the average temperature of many seasons averaged together, smoothed out by the rock's own slow memory of all the heat and all the cold that have passed through its surface over years and decades. It is stable, It is constant, it is cool, without being cold. It is the temperature of the Earth's own slow metabolism, insulated from the variability of the sky above by the sheer mass and density of the rock around it. For a city of 20,000 people, this is not a comfort feature. This is a survival feature. Food stored in that constant cool darkness lasts longer than food stored in the variable temperatures of the surface. Grain in deep rooms does not spoil in summer. Wine pressed from the plateau's grapes and carried to deep cellars does not turn in the warmth. The barrels and jars and sealed containers of oil and food and preserved things can wait in those rooms through months, through seasons, through however long the people above them need to remain below. And when the people finally come down to retrieve them, the stores are still good, still usable, still the difference between surviving a long period underground and not surviving it. The rock did not design this. Geology does not design anything. But the same volcanic events that gave this plateau its carvable rock also gave it a rock with these thermal properties, and the people who first began carving here, whether they understood the chemistry or simply felt the cool when they went in, whether they reasoned about the stability of underground temperatures or simply noticed that the food kept better in the deep rooms, were using all of these properties simultaneously. The softness for carving, the hardening for permanence, the thermal mass for preservation, and for the kind of stable, unchanging interior environment in which a large number of people can live for extended periods without being driven out by heat in summer or cold in winter. And one more thing, one more property of this same porous volcanic rock that reveals itself when you consider what it means to bring 20,000 people underground and keep them alive. The plateau receives rainfall. Water moves through the rock. Water saturating the tuff from above, finding its way through the porous material, accumulating in the deep zones below the carved levels, was the water that fed the wells. The deep shaft sunk through the levels of Derin Kuyu, the principal ventilation shaft sited at roughly 55 meters in depth, served more than one purpose. They were paths for air, but they were also paths to water. The same geological material that allowed carving allowed water to accumulate at depth, and the same shafts that brought fresh air from the surface down through 18 levels of carved rooms could also, when sunk deep enough, reach the water table below. The rock provided everything: soft enough to carve, hard enough to hold, cool enough to store, porous enough to hold water. These are not separate features of different materials. They are all properties of the same Ignimbrite tuff, the same consolidated ash from the same ancient explosive eruptions that built this plateau over millions of years of geological time. One material, one set of properties, one accident of geology that made everything else possible. Above, the fairy chimneys stand in the valleys wearing their caps, losing their caps, rising and falling over the long, slow rhythm of erosion. Below, the carved rooms and corridors wait in their settled darkness, their walls cured now, long since hardened, from the soft interior faces they once were, into the durable, permanent material they became the moment the tools moved on, and the air reached them, and the chemistry of the rock's surface began its slow, quiet work. The landscape of Cappadocia looks like nowhere else on Earth. It looks like a place that was designed or dreamed or perhaps built according to rules that do not apply elsewhere. The columns and the carved valleys and the strange hats of rock balanced on top of tall, pale spires, and the knowledge that beneath all of it, beneath the valley floor and the ridgelines and the sloping sides of the hills, there are rooms, there are corridors, there are stairways going down through 18 levels to a depth that a 20-story building would just about reach. It looks like the work of something other than ordinary geology and ordinary human labor. It looks like a place where the usual rules were suspended, but the usual rules were not suspended. They were the point. They were the engine of everything. The tuff was soft because it was laid down by pyroclastic flows that came to rest before their particles had time to be sorted and compacted into something denser and harder. The fairy chimneys rose because harder capstones protected soft columns from rain and wind, and the soft material all around them was taken away. The underground city went down because the same softness that let erosion work above let tools work below, and because the same case hardening that eventually took the tough surface into something tougher preserved what was cut before the tools moved on. The rock did everything. The rock made it all possible. The rock is still there, still doing what it has always done, still soft in its unexposed interior, and still hard at its cut faces, and still cool and constant in its deep chambers, and still holding, after all these centuries, the shape of what was carved into it by people whose names are mostly lost, and whose reasons we can only partly reconstruct, and whose work survives them by a margin that makes the word astonishing feel like the right one to reach for. The descent into Derinkuyu begins before you know you are descending. The upper levels are not dramatic in the way that a great cathedral is dramatic, not tall and opening and full of swept space. They are low and close and particular, the ceilings not far above the head, the corridors not wide, the rooms shaped by what was practical to carve and what the rock allowed, rather than by any ambition toward grandeur. But that closeness is itself part of what these levels were for. The upper levels were for the animals, the stables were near the surface, and the logic is practical and immediate. The livestock needed to breathe the freshest air, the air nearest the openings to the outside world, because the ventilation shafts distributed fresh air from the top down through the levels, and the air at the lower depths, while breathable, was the air that had already travelled through the rooms and corridors above. You put the animals near the top, where the air was freshest and where the weight of rock above them was least, and you went deeper yourself, into rooms carved for human habitation, for storage, for the particular activities that made a long period underground bearable and organized. The rock that forms these walls and ceilings was laid down without any thought for the civilization that would one day hollow it out. It was laid down by chemistry and heat and the settling of enormous quantities of pyroclastic material across a plateau that was, at the time of those eruptions, not populated by anyone who would one day notice that the ash had turned to stone and the stone was soft enough to cut. The eruptions happened, the material settled, the land over millions of years became what it became. And then much later people arrived, and they looked at this rock, and they understood what it offered, and they began. Where they began exactly and when exactly is a question that the rock itself has made difficult to answer, because the evidence of when a room was carved is in the material removed to make it. And that material is gone, taken out in baskets or sacks or whatever the tools and containers of the time allowed, carried to the surface, dispersed, mixed with the rubble and the soil of the landscape above, no longer identifiable as the specific carved-away rock from this specific tunnel in this specific level. The act of making a room destroys the evidence of when the room was made. The rock remembers the shape of the room. It does not remember the date it was cut. This is not a small problem for anyone trying to understand the history of this place with any precision. It is the central problem, and it is a problem that has allowed a range of claims to attach themselves to Derinkuyu over the years, some better supported than others. The question of who carved the first tunnels here, who began the descent, who made the earliest rooms in the highest levels from which everything else eventually grew, that question does not have a single firm answer, and the honest position is to say so plainly, which this narration intends to do. The deepest in time that the human archaeology of this region reaches with any confidence is to the period of the Phrygians, around the 8th and 7th centuries before the Common Era. The Phrygians were the people who occupied central Anatolia in that period, a culture that left its mark on the region in various ways, and some of the earliest evidence for the human use of these underground spaces is associated with this period, though the evidence is indirect enough that the association is cautious rather than certain. There are also claims that push the origin back further, to the Hittites, the earlier power of Anatolia, whose civilization reached its height well before the Phrygian era, and who were certainly capable of large-scale organized projects. But the claims of Hittite origin for Derinkuyu rest on reasoning that is more circumstantial than direct, and scholars approach that attribution with appropriate caution. The Hittites may have used underground spaces in Anatolia. They may have been among the first people to recognize what this particular rock offered. But the connection between the Hittites specifically and the specific excavation of Derinkuyu as we know it today is not settled by firm dating evidence, and to state it as fact would be to give the claim a confidence it has not yet earned from the archaeological record. What is certain is that the rock was here before any of them, and that the rock's properties were the same in the 8th century before the Common Era as they are now, and the same as they were long before that, and that whoever first brought a tool to these walls and began to cut found the same soft, moist interior face and the same hardening, cured surface, and the same cool, constant darkness that everyone who came after them also found. The rock does not care who carves it. It offers the same properties to every hand that reaches into it with a tool, regardless of the name of the civilization that holds the tool. And that is perhaps the most important thing to hold in mind as we go deeper. Because the deeper we go, the more pressing the question becomes. Not who cut these rooms, and not when, but how the people inside them stayed alive. Imagine for a moment what it would mean to descend 18 levels below the surface of the Earth with 20,000 other people. Not 20,000 in the abstract, as a census figure or a crowd at a distance, but 20,000 as a lived reality. 20,000 people who need to breathe, who need to drink water, who need to eat and sleep and move, and on occasion tend to livestock, keep wine, press oil from olives, and do all the unremarkable daily things that constitute a life. 20,000 people generate heat. They exhale. Fires are lit for cooking and warmth. Livestock breathe and release their own warmth into the air. In a sealed space underground, this would not be a city. It would be a catastrophe measured in minutes. That it did not become a catastrophe is the first great engineering achievement of Derinkuyu, and it is one that the rock itself made possible. The ventilation system at Derinkuyu is not a secondary feature, not an afterthought added when someone noticed the air going bad. It is structural to the whole enterprise, built into the conception of the place in a way that suggests the people who designed it, or who inherited and extended the design of those before them, understood, at least in practice, what we would now describe as fluid dynamics. Fresh air must have a way in. Stale air must have a way out, and in a complex of potentially 18 levels reaching down approximately 60 meters, the relationship between the surface and the deepest inhabited spaces is not simple. The principal ventilation shaft at Derinkuyu is sited at around 55 meters deep. That is a vertical bore, carved as everything here was carved, with the same tools that cut the rooms and passages into the same tuff that gave way to those tools, reaching from somewhere near the surface down through the rock to the inhabited levels below. 55 meters is not a small engineering accomplishment. In modern terms, 55 meters of vertical shaft is the height of a 15 or 16-story building, turned upside down, carved by hand into volcanic rock. And this shaft was not alone. Estimates of the number of ventilation shafts at Derinkuyu range from dozens to well over 50, a network of vertical bores distributed through the complex that together managed the movement of air through the underground spaces in a way that kept them breathable. The shafts serve a second function as well, and this is the detail that makes the engineering so elegantly practical. many of them double as well, or rather, many of the wells double as ventilation shafts. The same vertical bore that carries fresh air down from the surface also, at its base or along its course, gives access to groundwater. On the Anatolian plateau, in a region of volcanic rock where the water table sits at depths achievable by a long shaft, this convergence of functions is not a lucky accident. The rock that was carved away to make the shaft gave access, in a single vertical gesture, to both the air above and the water below. And because the shaft penetrates through multiple levels of the complex, water could be drawn and air could move without requiring the people inside to open any passage to the outside world. This is important for reasons we will come to shortly when we consider what the people inside Derinkuyu were sheltering from. For now, it is enough to hold the picture of the shafts, vertical channels moving through the rock, distributing air and water simultaneously, connecting the inhabited depths to the surface without creating any opening wide enough for a person to enter. The engineering is not dramatic in its appearance. There are no grand mechanical devices, no elaborate systems of bellows or pumps. It is geology recruited into the service of survival, the same principle that built the rooms applied vertically, a bore carved into soft, moist rock, cured by exposure, maintained by the slow movement of air through its length. The thermal properties of the rock contribute to this system in a way that is worth dwelling on for a moment. The Anatolian plateau sits at elevations of roughly 1,000 meters and above, and the climate there is one of considerable contrast. Hot summers, where the surface bakes in full sun, cold winters where the ground freezes and temperatures drop far below zero. The surface is not a comfortable place in either extreme, but underground, insulated by the thermal mass of meters and meters of volcanic tuff, the temperature stabilizes. The rock absorbs neither the summer heat nor the winter cold at any significant rate at depth. What remains is a consistent, cool, stable environment somewhere in the range that we would associate with a well-built cellar or a deep cave. Cool enough to be comfortable in summer, cool enough to preserve food, warm enough relative to a bitter winter. Above, that the underground represented genuine shelter rather than a different kind of cold. This thermal stability is not just comfort, it is function. Wine presses at Derinkuyu produced wine that needed to be stored, and a consistently cool environment at depth was the best natural refrigeration available. Food stores, grain, preserved foods, the supplies accumulated against the possibility of a long period underground, held better in that stable coolness than they would have on the surface. The same rock that was soft enough to carve became, once carved and occupied, a passive climate control system, a vast thermal buffer between the people inside and whatever the weather or the season was doing above. But there is something beyond the practical in that stable underground temperature. Lie still in a cool, quiet room and let the darkness settle around you. And there is a quality to the air, slightly earthy, slightly mineral, slightly cool against the skin, that has no counterpart on the surface. The people who lived in these rooms for days or weeks at a time would have learned that quality in the way that we learn the particular quality of our own beds, our own rooms, the dark behind our own closed eyes. The underground of Derinkuyu would have had a smell, tough dust, livestock, smoke from cooking fires drawn up through carved channels, the faint mineral tang of groundwater nearby. A specific, unmistakable smell that those who sheltered there would have associated with safety, with the cool weight of the rock above, with the knowledge that whatever was happening on the surface could not, for the moment, reach them. That sense of safety was not only provided by the rock's passivity, by its stillness and its temperature and its silence, it was also, and more dramatically, engineered into the structure itself. The rolling stone doors of Derinkuyu are among the most immediately striking features of the complex, and they repay slow attention. Each is a disc of stone, Descriptions place them at roughly 1 to 1.5 meters in diameter, with weights commonly cited between 200 and 500 kilograms. They are approximately circular, cut from the same tuff as everything else, and shaped specifically to fit across the width of a passage. To roll one into place across a corridor is to close that corridor completely, to fill the available opening with several hundred kilograms of stone in a way that a person approaching from the other side cannot easily move. And that is precisely the point, because the doors are designed to be operated from inside. The mechanism, and it is a mechanism engineered rather than improvised, consistent enough across multiple examples to suggest deliberate design rather than accident, is such that the person inside the passage can roll the door into the sealed position, and the person outside cannot. The door is smooth on the outside face, offering no purchase. From within, there are ways to move it, a lever point perhaps, or a carved grip. But from without, the stone presents itself as exactly what it appears to be: a wall. Not a door, a wall. This inversion, a door that is a wall from one side and a door from the other, is an architectural expression of a very specific social and political reality. The people inside Derinkuyu were not trying to keep their presence secret. The city's existence, presumably, was known. What the rolling stone doors achieved was not concealment but impregnability. They could not be opened from outside. They could not be pushed, pulled, or forced with the tools available to a person on the external face of a sealed passage. And because the passages of Derinkuyu are narrow enough in places to require moving in single file, narrow enough that a group of attackers cannot bring force to bear simultaneously, the combination of the constricted geometry and the immovable rolling door created a defense that was close to absolute. Some of the doors carry a small aperture, a hole at approximately the center of the disc. The function of this hole has been interpreted in different ways: as a point through which a lever could be inserted for moving the stone, as a defensive aperture through which those inside could observe or act against anyone attempting to breach the door, or as some combination of these purposes. The hole is not large. It is not an invitation. It is, if anything, an additional assertion of the asymmetry built into the door. Those inside can see through it, can potentially act through it, while those outside can do neither with any advantage. Spread across 18 levels, distributed through the complex so that each section could be sealed independently from those above and below it, these doors transformed the underground city into something more than a refuge. They made it into a fortress. Not a fortress with towers and battlements and men on walls, but a fortress carved downward, a fortress that used the weight of the earth itself as its outermost defense and the rolling stone as its innermost, a fortress that was safest at its greatest depth, where the accumulated mass of all those meters of rock above and around was itself the wall. The question of what the people inside were hiding from, what threat required this level of engineering, this investment of time and labor and ingenuity, this willingness to go down rather than up and to seal the door from inside, is a question we will come to. But before we follow the people of Derinkuyu up through their history, let us first follow them through their space, through the rooms and passages that constituted the underground city, because the lived reality of those spaces tells us something about the quality and intention of the whole enterprise that the engineering details alone cannot quite convey. The upper levels of Derinkuyu were given over to the animals. Stables occupy the levels nearest the surface, a practical decision that reflects the logic of the whole structure. Animals are heavy, animals are noisy, animals produce considerable quantities of warmth and waste and smell, and getting them in and out of an underground space is considerably easier if they do not have to navigate 12 or 15 levels of narrow, carved passage. The upper levels are the most accessible. They are the most easily ventilated by the system of shafts. They are the most easily reached in an emergency when the horses or the donkeys or the cattle that represented not just transport but wealth and food supply needed to be moved underground quickly. And so that is where the animals went, carved into the same tuff that later levels would give over to humans, their stalls shaped into the rock the same way that the human rooms were shaped, the logic of the material consistent from the stabling of animals to the construction of a church. The storage rooms are distributed through the complex, but their function is straightforward. Grain and food, wine and oil, the preserved and the fermentable and the dry, all the supplies that a community expecting to be underground for days or weeks or, in the worst circumstances, months needed to have within reach. The wine presses at Derinkuyu are not incidental. They suggest a community that was producing, not simply consuming, a community that had its own economic life underground, that was pressing its harvest into wine in spaces carved specifically for that purpose, with the weight of the rock above and the cool, stable temperature around providing the conditions that the work required. Wine pressed in a cool underground space, stored in the same cool underground space, would keep. It would age. It would be available when it was needed, and it would be good when it arrived. The kitchens carry their own evidence in the form of chimney soot still visible on the walls and ceilings of certain spaces. Fire was lit underground. Meals were cooked. The ventilation system managed the smoke, drawing it up and away through the carved shafts in the same movement that brought fresh air down. The soot is a trace of specific moments, specific fires, specific meals, specific evenings when someone stood in a carved room and cooked food for the people who lived around them, and the smoke rose and the air came in, and the meal was made, and the day continued. It is one of the most immediate of all the details that Derinkuyu offers, because soot does not need interpretation. It does not require scholarly debate or contested dating. It is simply the residue of fire, and fire means people, and people eating mean a community sustaining itself in circumstances that required it to sustain itself underground. The communal rooms are harder to characterize precisely because the function of a communal room in an underground city is not always self-evident from its shape. A large carved space could have served any number of purposes: gathering, sleeping in numbers, storage that was later cleared, gathering that shifted its character across the centuries as different communities used the same space for different ends. But the existence of spaces large enough to gather in, to sit in together, to do something collectively that required more room than a sleeping alcove or a storage niche, speaks to the same basic reality as the kitchens and the stables. This was a place designed for people to actually live, not just to crouch in the dark and wait for danger to pass. And then there is the church. On one of the lower levels of Derinkuyu, further down than the stables, further down than the storage rooms, deeper than the kitchens and the communal spaces, there is a room cut in the shape of a cross. A cruciform plan, the form used in Byzantine Christian church architecture, carved into volcanic tuff at a depth measured in tens of meters below the surface. The church at Derinkuyu is not grand in the way that a surface church built of stone or brick or marble might be grand. Its grandeur is of a different and arguably more striking kind. It is grand because it is here at all, because someone at some point in the long human occupation of these tunnels decided that the deepest levels, the most protected spaces, the innermost heart of the underground city, should contain not a treasury or an armory or a council chamber, but a place of worship. The cruciform plan is not accidental. It is a specific architectural choice that places this room unmistakably in the tradition of Byzantine Christian building, the same tradition that carved the churches into the cliff faces of Göreme above, the same tradition that covered the interiors of rock-cut chapels with frescoes of saints and apostles and scenes from scripture. The church at Derinkuyu was made by people who knew what a church should look like and who reproduced that form in the hardest possible circumstances, at the greatest possible depth, using the same tool against the same rock that carved everything else in the complex. The rock did not distinguish between a stable and a sanctuary. Both were cut from the same tuff with the same principle. But the people who cut them made the distinction, and they made it in the shape of the rooms. Near the church, or associated with the lower levels of the complex in ways that suggest a related function, is what has been interpreted as a religious or study space, a room or set of rooms given over to something that was not storage, not sleeping, not eating or cooking, or the tending of animals. The details of what specifically this space was used for resist confident declaration in the way that many aspects of Derinkuyu resist confident declaration. But its existence at depth near the church points toward a community that brought its spiritual and intellectual life underground with the same deliberateness with which it brought its livestock and its wine press. Whatever mattered on the surface mattered at depth. The underground city was not a last resort of bare survival. It was a civilization's attempt to preserve itself completely. Faith and learning alongside food and water and the ability to breathe. The tunnel stretches south through the dark. Kaymaklı is not far from Derinkuyu in surface distance. They are separate towns, separate sites, each with its own excavated underground complex. But beneath the surface, they are connected. A tunnel, commonly sited at somewhere between 8 and 9 kilometers in length, runs through the volcanic tuff between the two cities, linking their underground networks into something that functions, in intent, if not in regularity of use, as an underground road between two underground settlements. 8 or 9 kilometers of tunnel, carved by hand through the same soft rock with the same simple tools, at depths that kept the passage out of reach of anyone who did not know it was there and who did not know how to find it. And the tunnel did not simply connect one entrance to another in a straight line. The underground geography of the region is not simple, and the passage between Derinkuyu and Kaymaklı would have navigated through rock that presented different conditions along its length, requiring carving decisions and engineering judgments at every point. The existence of this tunnel transforms the way we think about the underground cities of Cappadocia. A single underground city might be thought of as a refuge, an isolated community dug into the rock of its particular location, self-contained, sufficient unto itself. But a tunnel connecting two such cities changes the category. Two connected underground cities with a passage between them long enough and deep enough and deliberately enough constructed are not two separate refugees. They are 2 points on a network. They are 2 nodes in a system that had its own internal logic, its own sense of relationship between communities, its own capacity for movement and communication below the surface of a dangerous world. And Derinkuyu and Kaymaklı are not the only such nodes. The region as a whole contains an estimated 200 and more underground settlements of varying size and ambition, dozens of these at substantial scale, with the smaller ones perhaps no more than a few rooms carved into a cliff face or a hillside, but many of them representing significant excavations with multiple levels, stables, storage, and all the features that suggest extended habitation rather than temporary hiding. 200 settlements distributed across the volcanic landscape of central Anatolia, carved from the same tuff, exploiting the same properties of the same rock, connected in some cases by tunnels that ran below the fields and the roads and the towns that sat above them. The network is not fully mapped. The rock does not yield its contents easily or consistently, and the same property that made it possible to carve these spaces, the soft interior face that gave way to simple tools, also means that portions of the network have collapsed or have been blocked, or have silted up with the debris of centuries in ways that have not yet been cleared by modern excavation. There are certainly passages and rooms and perhaps entire complexes that have not yet been rediscovered that sit in the volcanic tuff of Nevşehir province, beneath fields and roads and buildings, waiting for the moment when someone breaks through a wall or digs a foundation and finds a corridor leading somewhere unexpected. The 1963 discovery of Derinkuyu itself is a story that moves through the literature with a consistency that suggests a core of truth, though its precise details, as with so much in the history of this place, are stated with more confidence in popular accounts than the evidence quite supports. The story goes that a local resident undertaking renovation of his house broke through a wall and found a passage behind it, a passage that led, as passages in this region have a way of doing, into a network far older and far larger than anything above it. The story has the quality of a parable, the ordinary domestic act of renovation, the unexpected breakthrough, the discovery that the ground beneath the familiar is not empty but full. Whether the details of the 1963 account are precisely as often stated, the broad fact of modern rediscovery and subsequent excavation is certain. Derinkuyu was excavated and opened to researchers and eventually to visitors in the latter part of the 20th century, and what the excavations revealed. The stables and the kitchens and the wine presses and the church and the ventilation shafts and the rolling stone doors exceeded, in its complexity and its completeness, what the stories of underground cities in this region had suggested was possible. The UNESCO inscription of 1985 formalized something that the excavations had already made visible, that the landscape of Cappadocia is not separable into its natural and human components, that the fairy chimneys above and the carved cities below are not two different stories about the same place, but one story told from above and below simultaneously. The inscription covers Görem National Park and the rock sites of Cappadocia together, treating the volcanic formations and the rock-cut heritage as a single thing, which is what they are. The eruptions of Erciyes and Hasan and Göllüdağ produced the tuff. The tuff, softened by moisture and hardened by air, was carved by wind and water into chimneys above and by human hands into rooms below. UNESCO recognized in the language of international cultural and natural heritage what the geology had expressed for millions of years, that these two apparently different landscapes are the same landscape, and that the rock connecting them is the same rock. But to understand why the rooms were sealed from inside, why the engineering of defense was built into the very shape of the doors, why a community would choose to go deeper rather than to run, to understand all of that requires following the people of Derinkuyu, not just through space, but through time, through the centuries of use that the rock preserves in its soot and its crosses and its carved apertures, into the period for which we have the clearest evidence and the most specific account. The ventilation shafts descend with a kind of quiet engineering genius that rewards close attention. The principal shaft at Derinkuyu runs approximately 55 meters into the earth, a vertical column of moving air that threads through all 18 levels, carrying breath to spaces where no natural current could otherwise reach. There are dozens of these shafts throughout the complex, some sources counting over 50, and their arrangement is not accidental. They follow the logic of a city that could not afford to fail. A city where the difference between a working shaft and a blocked one was the difference between a population that survived and one that did not. Many of the shafts served a second purpose, reaching the water table and functioning as wells, so that the same vertical passage that carried air downward could carry water up. The people who carved these passages understood the physics of their situation with an intimacy that can only come from long experience of living underground, from generations of learning what the rock would permit and what it would not. And then there are the doors. They are roughly circular, cut from the same volcanic stone as the walls around them, somewhere between 1 and 1.5 meters across, and they weigh, depending on the individual stone and how estimates are made, somewhere between 200 and 500 kilograms. To call them heavy is to understate the point. They are the weight of something that cannot be moved quickly, cannot be nudged aside, cannot be overcome by the momentum of a single person pressing urgently against it from one side. They were rolled across the passages that connected the levels, and the geometry of their operation is the thing that matters most. They could only be rolled into position, only be sealed from the inside. A small central hole, present in some of them, has been interpreted as a defensive aperture, a place from which a weapon could be thrust or through which the situation on the other side of the door could be assessed without opening it. The engineering here is not the engineering of convenience. It is the engineering of a community that expected to be pursued, that expected to seal itself away from something coming down the passage, and that had thought carefully about what kind of door would give them the longest possible time behind it. The stone of Cappadocia made this possible. The same soft tuff that could be scraped away with antler or bone or iron was also the material from which these millstone doors were cut, and the rock's willingness to be shaped with precision meant that a door could be fitted to a passage with enough tolerance to roll and enough precision to seal. The hardening that occurred on the cut surfaces gave the door its durability. The weight gave it its effectiveness. The inside-only operation gave it its meaning. Below the doors, behind them, sealed within the levels they protected, the lived texture of the city survives in the details the rock preserved. The upper levels held stables. The evidence for this is not inferential. The dimensions of the spaces, the carved mangers, the logic of a community that brought its animals underground and needed them near the entrance where they could be managed, and where their warmth would not become a problem for the people sleeping deeper down. Storage rooms opened off the passages, their walls still bearing the marks of tools, their floors shaped to receive the vessels of grain and oil and preserved food that a population of 20,000 would need during an extended period below ground. Wine presses and oil presses were carved into the rock, functional equipment rather than ceremonial, the apparatus of an agricultural community that processed its harvest underground because that was where safety was. The kitchens left their own kind of record. The chimney soot is still visible on the stone above the cooking areas, a residue of thousands of meals prepared in firelight at the bottom of a mountain, the carbon of burning wood or dried dung settling into the porous tuff over decades and centuries, becoming part of the rock itself. That soot is among the most immediate things in Derinkuyu, more immediate than the doors, which are impressive, or the shafts, which are ingenious. The soot is ordinary. It is the mark of people making food, keeping warm, maintaining the routines of daily life inside a space that was also a fortification. It suggests that the underground city was not used only in emergency, that it was inhabited in a way that required cooking, that people were down here long enough to eat regularly, to sustain a household, to do the things that households do. Deeper still, on a lower level, there is a cruciform church. The shape is deliberate. The cross plan of Byzantine ecclesiastical architecture reproduced in rock, cut from the same volcanic tuff as everything else, a sacred space in the dark at the bottom of a carved city. And near it, or in a related space within the lower levels, what has been interpreted as a religious school or study space, a room set aside not for storage or sleep or food preparation, but for the transmission of something, learning, prayer, the maintenance of a particular way of understanding the world that the community had carried underground with it and intended to carry back out again when the time came. The church and the study space are the evidence that this was not merely survival. It was the preservation of a culture conducted underground, in rooms carved into the hardened ash, of ancient eruptions. And then the tunnel. Running southwest from Derinkuyu through roughly 8 to 9 kilometers of excavated rock, the passage connects to Kaymaklı, another underground city of comparable complexity, a separate settlement with its own levels and stables and storage rooms and ventilation shafts and stone doors. The tunnel between them is not a curiosity, it is infrastructure. It is an underground road connecting two underground cities, a route along which people and information and perhaps supplies could move without surfacing, without exposing themselves to whatever was happening above. The Cappadocian network of underground settlements numbers over 200 in total, many of them modest in scale, some of them substantial. They are distributed across the region in a pattern that suggests not a single act of construction, but a tradition, a way of relating to the rock that developed over a very long time and that expressed itself differently in different places according to local geology and local need. Derinkuyu is the deepest of them. Kaymaklı is among the largest in terms of surface area. Between them and around them, the tuff holds the carved evidence of a civilization that looked at soft volcanic rock and understood it immediately and practically as the material from which shelter could be made permanent. And here is where the story becomes genuinely difficult to tell with precision because the rock itself has taken care of the evidence. When you carve into tuff, you remove material, that is by definition the point. But the material you remove is the material an archaeologist would need to date. Organic material trapped in undisturbed sediment can be measured by radiocarbon methods. Crystals formed in volcanic ash can be dated by their decay signatures, but the act of cutting stone removes exactly those markers from the cut surface, and what remains is a wound in the rock with no birth date visible inside it. The walls of Derinkuyu are smooth where hands and tools work them, and that smoothness is itself a kind of erasure. The carvers took the evidence with them when they hauled the rubble out. What is left is the shape of the absence, and shapes, without additional context, do not carry dates the way organic remains do. This is not a failure of archaeology, it is a property of the material and the method. Underground cities carved from tuff are among the most resistant subjects to precise dating that the ancient world offers. You can analyze artifacts left behind, pottery shards, lamp niches, the residue of soot in a kitchen chimney, organic matter in a storage jar. And those things give you windows, ranges, periods of use. But use is not origin. A room used in the 7th century could have been carved in the 12th century before that, or the 2nd. The soot tells you when someone last lit a fire in the kitchen. It does not tell you when the kitchen was first hollowed from the mountain. And so when you ask who built Derinkuyu, who carved the first passage and drove the first shaft downward into the soft volcanic ash of the Anatolian plateau, the honest answer is that no one can say with confidence. Not yet, and perhaps not ever, in the way we would like. There are candidates, there are arguments, there are layers of history that left traces, and from those traces, careful reasoning can build a probable sequence. But the first tunnel, the first descent, the person who first understood that this particular rock could be opened and inhabited, that moment is not recoverable in the way a dated inscription is recoverable, or the way a sealed tomb with its contents intact is recoverable. The beginning is inside the uncertainty. The candidate most frequently named in the older literature is the Phrygians. The Phrygians were an Anatolian people, speakers of an Indo-European language, who established a significant presence in central Anatolia roughly around the 8th and 7th centuries before the Common Era. They built and they carved, and the region that would become Cappadocia sat within or adjacent to their sphere. Some researchers examining the overall design principles of the underground settlements, the proportions of certain passages and chambers, the logic of the layout, have suggested that the Phrygians were the likely initiators of the large-scale excavation tradition in the region. It is a reasonable attribution. It is supported by the temporal overlap and by what is known of Phrygian material culture. It is not, however, proven by direct dating of the rock itself, because that dating cannot be done from the cut surfaces alone. There is another claim, older and more contested. Some sources reaching further back in the record have attributed the earliest tunneling not to the Phrygians but to the Hittites. The Hittites were a Bronze Age power of considerable scale and sophistication. Their empire centered in Anatolia and reaching its height roughly in the 2nd millennium before the Common Era, some centuries before the Phrygians. The claim that the Hittites initiated underground construction in Cappadocia is not without a certain logic. The Hittites were active in the region. They built extensively and engineered well. It is not inconceivable that communities under Hittite influence, or Hittite administrators themselves, would have begun the process of modifying the soft tuff for shelter or storage. But the attribution rests on circumstantial reasoning more than on direct evidence. There are no securely dated Hittite artifacts from the lowest, earliest levels of the underground cities that would confirm Hittite hands as the originators. The claim appears in the record, and it appears with enough frequency that it must be acknowledged, but it is contested, and the honest position is to hold it as a possibility rather than a settlement. What this means, in practical terms, is that the underground cities of Cappadocia do not have a single author. They have layers. Different communities at different moments in a very long history encountered the same rock, understood the same soft yet hardening property, and cut further, added rooms, dug another level, connected one chamber to the next. The cities are not the product of a single act of vision, though the vision required to build any one level is itself extraordinary. They are the product of accumulation. Each generation that sheltered there added something, or deepened something, or modified a passage to suit a new purpose. The rock permitted all of it because the rock remained what it had always been, soft at the interior face and hardening at the surface, workable with the tools each era brought to it. The period that left the most legible traces, the best documented chapter of occupation, belongs to the Greek-speaking Christian communities of Byzantium. From the 7th century through the 10th century of the Common Era, the region that would become known as Cappadocia was caught between two expanding forces. The Byzantine Empire and the expanding Arab powers engaged in a prolonged and violent contest for control of Anatolia. The border shifted, raids penetrated deep into the plateau. Communities that might once have trusted the walls of a city or the defenses of a fortified settlement found themselves in an unpredictable landscape where an enemy could arrive from almost any direction and where speed and mobility often outmatched conventional fortification. The underground cities answered a different logic. You cannot raid something you cannot find. You cannot besiege something that has no identifiable exterior. If the entrance is concealed, if the passages inside it sealed from within, if the network of rooms can shelter an entire population with enough food and water to outlast a passing threat, then the rock itself becomes the defense. And the tuff of Cappadocia, in this strategic sense, was worth more than stone walls. Stone walls have an outline visible from a distance. The volcanic plateau of central Anatolia has no outline because the city is inside the mountain, and the mountain looks from above like a mountain. The rolling stone doors make complete sense in this context. Each one seals a passage from the inside, operated by the people who are sheltering, not by anyone approaching from without. The central aperture in some of them, that small hole through the thickness of the stone, has been interpreted as a defensive aperture, a point through which a spear or similar implement could be thrust outward while remaining inaccessible from the outside. It is, in other words, a door that is also a weapons position. You are behind it, safe, sealed, and still capable of defending the threshold. And if you need to move through the complex without surfacing, you have the tunnel, 8 or 9 kilometers southwest through solid rock, and you emerge in Kaymakli, another shelter, another sealed and ventilated network, and you have made the journey without crossing a single field that could be watched from a hillside. The Byzantine Christians who sheltered in the underground cities were not primitive communities making the best of difficult circumstances. They brought their faith with them, literally. The cruciform church carved into one of the lower levels of Derinkuyu is not a gesture toward religion made under duress. It is a fully realized liturgical space shaped in the form that Byzantine Christianity understood as correct for worship, complete with the proportions and the architectural logic of the tradition above ground, simply transposed into a medium that happened to be the soft ash of ancient eruptions rather than cut limestone or fired brick. Worship continued underground, the structure of the faith continued underground, the study space continued underground. The community did not abandon the things that constituted it as a community simply because the community was below the surface. It brought those things down with it, the way it brought the livestock into the upper levels and the wine press into the room that had been carved for exactly that purpose. The Arab-Byzantine wars were not the only crisis that sent people below. Later, as the medieval period gave way to other configurations of power, as Ottoman authority extended across Anatolia, the communities of Cappadocia continued to use the underground settlements. The reasons shifted, the specific pressures changed, but the basic calculation remained the same. The rock was available, the passages were already there or could be deepened. The sealed doors still worked from the inside. Whatever was happening above, the tuff below offered a version of safety that the surface could not always guarantee. And in all of this, across the long layered history of occupation and refuge, the text of Xenophon sits at an interesting angle. Xenophon was a Greek soldier and writer of the 4th century before the Common Era, a near contemporary of Socrates, a man who left one of the most vivid and immediate accounts of a military expedition that antiquity has given us. His work, known as the Anabasis, describes the march of a Greek mercenary force through Anatolia, a journey that took him and his companions through landscapes that would have included regions adjacent to or within what we now call Cappadocia. In one passage, he describes the local population living in underground dwellings reached by ladders, with chambers below ground that housed both the people and their livestock. He notes that the entrances were narrow like wells from above, opening into wider chambers beneath. Xenophon does not name Derinkuyu. He does not describe an 18-level city for 20,000 people. What he describes is the principle, the basic arrangement, the logic of underground dwelling that the tuff of central Anatolia had already been teaching its inhabitants for a very long time before his march took him through. His account is not proof of any specific construction. It is, rather, a witness statement from a literate outsider who encountered the tradition in practice and found it worth recording because it was unusual to him, though evidently not unusual to the people living it. They had ladders, they went down, the livestock was there, it worked. That texture of ordinariness in Xenophon's account is perhaps the most revealing thing about it. He describes underground living not with the register of shock that a traveler encountering something truly novel might use, but with the register of a careful observer noting a regional practice. It was the kind of dwelling that people in this part of Anatolia lived in. That is all. Which means that by the 4th century before the Common Era, underground habitation was already old enough, already established enough, that it read as characteristic of the region rather than as a wonder requiring extended explanation. The long tradition then extends further back than the Byzantine period that left the clearest documentary traces. It extends further back than the Phrygian period that the architectural evidence most plausibly supports. It reaches toward a beginning that the rock itself has hidden, because the rock, when carved, takes the date of its own shaping with it into the rubble hauled out through the passage. The 1963 story is one that appears across almost every account of Derinkuyu, repeated so consistently and with such satisfying narrative shape that it has become the official version of the city's modern reappearance into the wider world's awareness. The account holds that in 1963 a local resident in the town of Derinkuyu was renovating his home. In the course of that work, he broke through a wall or cleared away material that had accumulated over the passage to a lower chamber and found himself looking into a passage that led further and further and down through levels that had been closed for a very long time. The network was rediscovered not by an expedition, not by archaeologists with instruments and permits and research agendas, but by someone fixing a wall. The story has the quality of a good discovery narrative, the coincidence of the ordinary task revealing the extraordinary thing. And it fits the underground cities well because the cities themselves were designed to be undetectable from above. If they were built to be invisible to raiding forces, it is entirely consistent that they remained invisible, or at least largely unremarked upon, until someone's renovation work crossed the threshold of a sealed passage. The specific details of the 1963 account, the particular homeowner, the particular wall, the particular moment, rest on sources that are more journalistic than strictly archaeological, repeated across the popular literature with the confidence of settled fact. The broad truth, that the extent of the underground network was not fully recognized or systematically excavated until the modern era, and that local people sometimes encountered passages in the course of ordinary life above ground, is well supported. Treat the 1963 homeowner story as the shape the tradition has taken, accurate in its broad outline, held lightly in its specific details. What followed the rediscovery, however characterized, was excavation and study, and eventually the integration of the site into the frameworks of cultural heritage protection that the 20th century assembled for places of exceptional significance. In 1985, the United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization, UNESCO, inscribed Göreme National Park and the rock sites of Cappadocia as a World Heritage Site. The inscription is notable for its framing. It does not separate the geological formations from the human constructions. It does not treat the fairy chimneys as nature and the underground cities as culture, and then manage them as two parallel categories that happen to share a geography. It inscribes them together as a single site, recognizing that the exceptional value of Cappadocia lies in their combination and in the relationship between them. The nature made the culture possible. The culture extended and transformed the nature. The UNESCO designation captures something true about the place, even if institutional language rarely captures it with elegance. The fairy chimneys and the underground city are not two wonders that happen to arise in the same region. They are the same event, seen from two different directions. Stand above ground in the valleys near Göreme and look at the pillars rising around you, the soft columns of tuff tapering toward hard volcanic caps, the remnants of a landscape shaped by the same pyroclastic flows that buried Erciyes and Hasan and Göllüdağ's output across millions of years of eruption. The fairy chimneys are what the surface did with the tuff when the agents of erosion, wind, freeze-thaw cycles, rain moving across the plateau at 1,000 meters of elevation, had long enough and soft enough material to work with. The cap rock sits on top not because it fell there recently, but because it is slightly harder, slightly more erosion resistant, and so it outlasted the material around it. Over time, that unequal resistance produced the hat and the column beneath it. When the hat eventually fails, when weathering reaches the point where the protective cap can no longer hold itself in place, it falls, and then the column that it sheltered begins to lose its taper and dissolve back into the slope because nothing is protecting it any longer. Below ground, the same tuff yielded to a different kind of work. Not wind and water and the slow physics of freeze-thaw, but hands and tools. The same softness that let differential erosion carve pillars over a surface let iron picks and antler implements cut rooms into the rock face. The same case hardening that preserved the fairy chimney's column once the external surface dried and reacted did the same for a carved wall in a chamber 18 levels below the plateau surface, stabilizing what had been exposed and leaving the cut surfaces more durable than the material had been before it was disturbed. The rock did not resist the process in either case. Above, it yielded to the slow abrasion of the elements. Below, it yielded to the deliberate force of people who understood what they were working with. Two sets of tools, two timescales, two resulting shapes. One rock. This is the thing that the standard presentation of Cappadocia as a pair of separate marvels, the scenic formations above, the mysterious city below, tends to lose. The apparent mystery of the underground city dissolves almost completely once you understand the rock that made it possible. Not entirely, because the social history remains genuinely uncertain, the dating problem remains genuinely unresolved, and the scale of the human effort involved remains genuinely staggering even when you understand the mechanism. But the question that most accounts leave open, how was this possible? How could people have dug so deep with so little? What allowed this? Is not unanswerable. It is answered by the tuff. It is answered by pyroclastic flows that settled as low-density, porous, weakly cohesive material across the central Anatolian plateau in the late Miocene and through the Quaternary. It is answered by the specific chemistry of the surface reaction that hardens exposed tuff as it loses moisture and its minerals interact with air so that every cut face begins immediately to protect itself. It is answered by the thermal mass of the rock that held the underground chambers at a stable, cool temperature through the hot summers and cold winters of the continental plateau climate, making them useful not only as refuges but as permanent environments for living and storage, and the pressing of wine and the sheltering of livestock. The mystery, honestly examined, is really geology. And the geology is genuinely extraordinary, far more so than the kind of mystery that rests on unanswerable questions and dramatic atmosphere. Because what the geology did here is not the sort of thing rocks do everywhere. This particular combination, eruptions of sufficient scale from Erciyes and Hasan and Göllüdağ, depositing material across a wide plateau, producing ignimbrite and softer tuff layers in proportions and at depths that happen to make them carvable by human hands in a region where human communities had continuous reason to want to go underground, is specific. You cannot replicate it wherever there are volcanoes. You need the right kind of volcano producing the right kind of material at the right density. You need the right climate on the right elevated plateau to drive the erosion patterns that produce the fairy chimneys above while leaving the subsurface accessible below. And you need the people who, over a very long time and under various kinds of pressure, chose to use it. Cappadocia had all of it at once. What you are left with when you trace the full arc is something that resists the kind of explanation that requires a single cause or a single author. The eruptions happened over millions of years. The erosion shaped the surface over thousands of centuries. The first person who cut a tunnel into the soft face of the rock made a decision whose moment we cannot recover. The Phrygians, most likely, deepened what they found or extended what they started, building the organized, multi-purpose underground settlement that later generations would continue to modify. Byzantine Christians sealed themselves inside the rolling stone doors and prayed in cruciform churches carved far below the surface where Arab cavalry could not reach them. Someone's kitchen fire left soot on a ceiling that has now been there for over 1,000 years, and that ceiling is solid and stable because the tough case hardened around the fire's warmth and the room's air and the slow passage of time. A homeowner in 1963 broke through a wall and found beyond it the evidence of all of this. And UNESCO in 1985 looked at the fairy chimneys and the underground city and the rock-cut churches of Göllüdağ and said, this is one place. Not two categories of remarkable things sharing a map reference, but one place where the natural and the human are inseparable because they are made of the same material, shaped by the same property, produced ultimately by the same set of ancient eruptions from the three volcanoes on the Anatolian plateau. The inscription is, in its way, the most accurate summary of Cappadocia that exists in official language. One site, one landscape, one rock. Imagine standing on the plateau as the light falls in the late afternoon. The fairy chimneys around you are still in the cooling air, their caps throwing small shadows that lengthen as the sun descends. The tuff is pale gold in that light, or rose, or the color of dry sand, depending on where you stand and which layer the erosion has revealed. The valley below you holds dozens of pillars, and beyond them the surface of the plateau stretches toward the long, dark profiles of Erciyes and Hasan on the horizon, their volcanic shapes unmistakable even at distance, the sources of everything around you and everything beneath your feet. The rock you are standing on was once in the air. It was hot gas and ash and pumice, moving across the ground faster than wind and much heavier, compressing and welding as it came to rest across the landscape over a time so long and so repetitive that the individual eruptions blur into a geological event rather than a series of moments. Then it cooled. Then the sky worked on it, and the freeze-thaw cycles of the high plateau cracked and stripped the unprotected surfaces while the harder caps sheltered the columns below them. Then people came, and beneath your feet, following the gradient of the same rock, down through its layers, the city that was cut into it goes down and down. The upper levels with their stables and their storage rooms, the middle levels with their kitchens and their communal spaces, the lower levels with the church and the study room and the sealed passages, and below those, the levels that have not yet been fully mapped and documented. 60 meters is the figure most commonly given for the depth of the excavation. 18 levels, 20,000 people in a shelter that had no sky, that was lit by oil lamps or torches, that was kept at the stable, cool temperature the rock naturally maintains through all seasons. The ventilation shafts, dozens of them, some reaching 55 meters from the surface to the deepest rooms, carried the air that kept all of those people alive, the same air that moved through a rock originally soft enough to scrape with a bone. The stone doors are rolled back now. The passages are lit for visitors who descend not in crisis, but in curiosity, ducking through the narrower sections, feeling the temperature change as they go deeper, hearing the sound of the plateau above them become increasingly abstract and distant. The soot is still on the kitchen ceiling. The wine press is still in the room where it was carved. The church is still cruciform, still properly oriented, still the shape of what the people who sheltered here believed. The tunnel heading southwest toward Kaymaklı is still there, 8 or 9 kilometers of it, still connecting the two underground cities as it has for as long as it has existed, which is longer than anyone has been able to precisely determine. The dating problem will probably never fully resolve, not completely. There will be more work, more careful analysis of residues and deposits, and the artifacts that accumulate over long periods of habitation, and each piece of work will narrow the uncertainty a little further. But the first passage, the first deliberate cut into the soft face of the tuff by the first person who decided to go down rather than remain above, that moment is held inside the rock in a form that carving itself has made unretrievable. The beginning is the one thing the rock took with it when the tool struck and the material came away. What remains is everything that followed the beginning, which is more than enough. The eruptions from Erciyes and Hasan and Göllüdağ did not intend any of this. Geology has no intentions. The pyroclastic flows that swept across the Anatolian plateau did so because pressure and heat and the physics of the Earth's interior had built to the point where release was inevitable, and the material that settled across the landscape in the late Miocene and through the Quaternary settled the way hot ash and pumice settle densely in deep layers across a wide area, cooling and welding and producing the specific texture and hardness and porosity that would, millions of years later, prove carvable with antler and bone and iron. The volcano did not leave an invitation, but the rock was an invitation, and people read it. They read it in the way that people read available materials, pragmatically and over long stretches of time, finding the uses that the material's properties make possible, and then extending those uses until the properties have been fully exploited. What you have in Cappadocia is the full exploitation. Fairy chimneys above, reaching toward the sky with their absurd hats, their pointed columns, their folk associations with the spirits that must surely inhabit anything so strange. Underground cities below, reaching toward the depths with their 18 levels and their ventilation shafts and their sealed stone doors and their church and their soot-marked kitchen ceiling. The same eruptions above the surface and below it, the same rock shaped by two different forces into two different kinds of spectacular. And in between, the plateau at 1,000 meters, the continental climate of hot summers and cold winters, the thermal mass of the tuff, maintaining its constant cool underground, the landscape where the volcanoes are still visible on the horizon. It is one of those places in the world where the geology did something unrepeatable, where a specific combination of material and climate and time produced a landscape that exists nowhere else in quite this form. The inscription in 1985 was recognition of that singularity. But the singularity was older than 1985 by an interval difficult to express in ordinary time. The eruptions that produced the rock began approximately 10 million years ago and continued into the relatively recent geological past, under 2 million years ago, with volcanic activity persisting in the broader region for far longer. The window of human occupation within that geological history is brief, a thin layer near the surface of the stratigraphic record, and within the human occupation, the documented history, the Phrygians, the Byzantine Christians, the Arab-Byzantine Wars, the Ottoman period, the homeowner in 1963, is briefer still. But the rock persists through all of it, soft when wet, hardening when dry, carvable from the moist interior face, stable at the exposed surface. The same property that let the first tool cut the first passage is the same property that has held the passage open for however many centuries it has been open. The tuff does not forget what it is. The pyroclastic flow that created it determined its nature long before anyone arrived to make use of that nature, and its nature has not changed in all the time since. There is something in that, in the idea that the rock simply was what it was, and that everything extraordinary about this landscape is a consequence of that single physical fact, that is quieter than the mystery it displaces. The mystery version of Cappadocia asks unanswerable questions and leaves you with a comfortable sense of the ancient and inexplicable. The geological version answers the questions it can answer, admits the ones it cannot, and leaves you with something more interesting. The recognition that the ordinary physics of cooling ash and differential erosion and case-hardening surfaces produced, without any intent or design, a landscape where people could carve an entire civilization downward into the earth and leave the evidence of it standing for thousands of years, stable and cool and ventilated and sealed. The tuff did not need to be anything other than what it was. That was enough. The fairy chimneys are still there, catching the last of the light, their shadows lengthening across the valley floor. Below them, 60 meters below the plateau surface, The stone doors are rolled back and the passages are quiet, and the rock that holds all of it is the same rock it has always been. The settled residue of ancient fire, workable and self-hardening, the substance from which an entire buried world was made. If this kind of slow journey into the deep past is the thing that helps you find your way towards sleep, if the long descents into geology and stone and the layered decisions of people now long gone are useful to you in the quiet hours, then there are more stories here of this same unhurried kind, waiting for whenever you want them. And if you feel moved to share where in the world you are listening from tonight, I would genuinely like to know. The comments are there, and I read them. It is always something to learn which part of the world is quiet right now. Which time zone has reached the hours where the lights are low and the day has finally finished asking things of you. You have done enough for one night. The volcanoes are old and still. The rock is holding everything it was asked to hold. The passages are cool and the doors are open, and the city is at rest. History will still be here in the morning. For now, rest.